Good morning, everyone. We will start in about 1 minute. If somebody who's joined the call could please just give me a thumbs up or confirm that they can hear me, that would be fantastic. Excellent. Thank you. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are around the world. I'd like to begin this meeting by acknowledging the Jagera and Turrbal people as the traditional custodians of the lands on which TIQ is located, and acknowledge the custodians of all other lands where everyone online is dialing into this meeting from today. And I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, including First Nations persons who are in the meeting today. Welcome to today's Global Insight Series webinar, Trade Tariffs and Policy Updates, Navigating Changes in the US Market, brought to you by Trade and Investment Queensland, Queensland Government's dedicated global business agency for international investment and trade. My name is Scott Russell. I'm the Insights Manager here at TIQ, and I'm delighted to be co-hosting this session today in collaboration with our North America team. TIQ has a global network, and that includes 27 locations across 18 international markets, and that's reflected in the composition of our presenters and guest speakers today. We have speakers in Brisbane, Sydney, Bangkok, New York, San Francisco, and Virginia, and shortly you will hear an introduction to each of our guests for the day. Look, before we get into the formal part of the session, just wanted to cover a few housekeeping things. Firstly, today's session will be recorded, so if you need to drop off, we will send out a link so you can catch up on anything you missed. Secondly, we will do a Q&A. Please drop your questions in the chat as the session goes along, and we'll come to those at the end. If you do have a particular speaker or presenter that you'd like to direct your question to, please mention that in your comment as well, and we'll facilitate that conversation at the end. And then lastly, today's just the start. At the end, we'll finish with a brief overview on how TIQ can help you. Look, I'll just give a quick overview of what you'll learn today, and then I'll hand over to Vicky Forrest, TIQ's Senior Trade Commissioner for the Americas, and then we'll hear from our guest speakers who Vicky and Anise Reid from our US team will introduce shortly. Today, you will hear an overview of the free trade agreement between the US and Australia. You'll learn how the US trade tariff system works. We'll talk about potential changes under the Trump administration, and also discuss e-commerce market impacts before a facilitated Q&A at the end. Before I hand over to Vicky, I did just want to offer up a couple of thoughts to anchor today's conversation. Each speaker, of course, will have their own thoughts and perceptions of what's happening in the world. But I think here at TIQ and in the Insights team, we spend all this time, trying to make sense of all this change that's happening in the world, and possibly a couple of things to sort of anchor today's conversation down. Firstly, look, there's a lot of noise. I think listen to what's actually happening. I think as it stands today, where we, as we embark on this session this morning, only a minuscule portion of Queensland exports have been impacted. So I think the lesson there is don't jump at shadows. Let's learn what's actually happening and sort of think that through. And then secondly, probably the other point I just wanted to make to start, tariffs obviously can be a negative thing on trade, absolutely. But I think one thing from TIQ we're quite keen to emphasise is there can be both opportunities and challenges. So just a couple of points to bear in mind as context for today's call. Look, with that, I'll hand over to Vicky and I'll rejoin you at the end of the session to facilitate the Q&A. Over to you, Vicky.
Thanks very much, Scott. And I'm delighted to welcome everybody to this session. We had some challenges deciding what would be the best timing for this session. We were inundated with queries from Queensland exporters from a number of weeks ago, six or 7 weeks ago, and we were waiting, as Scott just said, to be able to give you some concrete facts. Things are moving very quickly. We have got 3 experts on today's webinar for you. They will tell you what they know at this stage, and rest assured TIQ North America will keep you updated on a very regular basis as things continue to change and move. I want to thank Anise and Hannah for the tremendous job they've done in pulling this webinar together, and now hand over to Anise to introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Vicky. Hi, everyone. I'm Anise Reid, Senior Manager for Trade from our New York office. I'm happy to introduce our expert speakers in order of appearance today. First up, Lisa McCauley is the CEO of the Global Trade Professionals Alliance and Director of both GTP Services and the Global Trade Alliance in the US. With 20 years of experience in international trade, Lisa has advised the World Customs Organization, the WTO, UN trade bodies, and APEC. She's contributed to Australia's National Committee for Trade Facilitation, the OECD's report on service sector competitiveness, and the ASEAN Summit. Lisa is a leading voice in digital trade, blockchain standards, e-commerce, and sustainable development. Welcome, Lisa. Next, we have Marianne Rowden, CEO and Director of the E-Merchants Trade Council, an international association focused on simplifying cross-border trade, tax, and transport for the global e-commerce sector. She has 2 decades of experience in trade law and policy, working with the WTO, World Customs Organization, and UNCTAD. She served 3 terms as co-chair of the WCO's e-commerce working group and has testified before Congress. Marianne has taught trade and homeland security law at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and is a powerful advocate for small and mid-sized e-commerce businesses worldwide. So we're very delighted to have you, Marianne. And finally, our third speaker, Michael Rowe, is a highly regarded international trade attorney with over 30 years of experience advising companies on complex import and export regulations. He's a founding partner at Rowland Harris LLP and has represented businesses on major trade issues, including the Section 301 tariffs on Chinese origin goods, compliance with the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, and customs audits. Mike is also a recognized authority on supply chain security and has helped companies achieve certification under the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. He has presented widely across North America and has written extensively on international trade law. Thanks for joining us, Mike. And now I'll pass you on to Lisa to kick us off with a quick look at the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to keep my presentation pretty tight, so we'll be moving through the presentation fairly quickly, but the idea is that you will get the information anyway, regardless afterwards. So if we could go to the next slide. Firstly, in the context of my presentation on OSVTA, I just want to sort of re-emphasize that trade agreements are essentially about leading to freer trade. But there are still other challenges as a business in any market that you operate that you may still need to overcome. So I often talk about free trade agreements as being like the cherry on top of a cupcake. So it's great that we have the advantage, but we always have to remind there are other factors in terms of when you look at the cost of doing business and how to do business. So OSVTA does provide many opportunities for Queensland exporters and investors to expand their business into the US market. And by doing that, you will achieve significant growth and commercial benefits. One of the things around us having a free trade agreement compared to other markets is it does give you a competitive advantage over other businesses looking to do business in the United States. So if we put it in that context, it does present several opportunities. If we could go to the next slide, please. Next slide. As in operating any market, it's always important that you know your market. So research your market opportunities under OSVTA and understand the market you are planning to do business with. Undertake a complete market entry checklist for the United States if this is a new market that you're considering going into, or if it is a market that you're already operating in, you may want to re-look at those market entry checklists. It is really important that you leverage the support of the network that is around you. That's the TIQ network, both in Queensland and overseas in the United States, as well as chambers of commerce that operate in the United States and industry bodies. Next slide, please. Apparently, people can't see the slides.
Yeah, Lisa, we might reshare from a different machine.
Okay.
If you are happy to continue your presentation while we just transition to another computer with the sharing. All right, one moment.
Great.
Some people can see it, some can't, but we'll reshare from a different machine. All right,
Right.
stand by.
Okay. So just to give context, Australia, we often refer to ourselves as the lucky country, and we are a lucky country. And a classic example of that is our free trade network. This is a snapshot of all of the free trade agreements that Australia is party to. You will also see there is an overlap with what are called regional trade agreements. So that is, for example, CTPP and ANZBTAR. Now, just a reminder, CTPP opens up opportunities in North America, in Mexico and Canada, but the USA was not privy to signing that agreement. So whenever looking at AUSVITAR or any free trade agreement that Australia is a part of, it's always really important that you look at the context of that agreement within the broader context of other agreements that we have, because that will also influence many supply chain decisions that you might be making. So next slide, please.
Sorry,
So,
Lisa, they'll just be up in a second.
okay.
My apologies.
It's all good. So probably for a lot of Australian exporters, AUSVITAR hasn't really been in the spotlight because we've signed other agreements in recent years. So this is just a reminder that we have had this agreement since 2005. It's quite a long-standing agreement, and since it was first negotiated, we haven't had any renegotiations on the agreement. So the original agreement that was signed in 2005 is the agreement that we are party to today. One of the significant things about AUSVITAR is that more than 97% of any Australian exports, bar certain non-agricultural exports, are exempt from tariffs. So as of now, that's 96.1% of all Australian exports are tariff-free. And my colleagues are going to get into some of the announcements about aluminium later. One of the other benefits from AUSVITAR is all Australian companies have access to bid on federal government procurement in the United States, as well as to bid for state contracts. But it's only 31 states that we have signed up on government procurement. So just to go through key takeaways for you as your business in terms of AUSVITAR: tariff elimination and market access. That is the number one benefit. So sorry, I've moved on to the next slide. Reduction of non-tariff barriers. So these are things such as certification and other technical regulations that you might incur. Investment and service. The AUSVITAR gives greater access to the US market for Australian service providers in areas like finance, education, and environmental services. It does offer strengthened investor protections. Next slide, please. There is an agreement on quarantine and standards, which obviously is quite important, particularly for agricultural exporters to the United States. There is an agreement and a commitment towards working to simplified customs procedures to make trade more efficient, but I think Marianne will touch more on what's going on in that space. It also does enforce stronger IP rights to safeguard your business operating in the US. And next slide, please. As I've mentioned, it does give Australian firms an opportunity to bid on US contracts. There is also an agreement on e-commerce and digital trade. And obviously we have an ISDS clause with the United States. Next slide, please. Unlike other free trade agreements that Australia has signed, this particular agreement does not require a formal certificate of origin for claiming your tariff. Instead, the onus is on the importer. In this case, the importer is the US importer. I just really want to make that very clear. So it's the US importer that's importing your goods that has the responsibility, and there is no prescribed format. Next slide, please. So there are two other important things to note on this in terms of customs verification, in that you still need to maintain records for up to 5 years because you could be asked to be audited at any time. So whilst there isn't a formal requirement for a certificate of origin, it is really important that you are keeping those records in case you get audited. Final point that I want to make is that under this agreement, any country at any time can actually ask for a renegotiation. We haven't to date, but it can happen. And final slide, please. And if you're after resources on how best to access the US Free Trade Agreement, obviously many of you are experienced exporters, but I'm sure you've all come across the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's Free Trade Agreement tool. The link is in the PowerPoint. And the GTPA has also recently released some new resources on supply chain diversification kit and a supply chain strategy template for SMEs. So the quick intro, and I'll hand over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Over to you, Michael. Oh, Marianne.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be speaking with my colleagues who I've known for several years. And I know that most of you are business people, so we'll try to keep this as practical as possible. This may seem a little legalistic, but it's really just to make you aware that unlike most countries, the United States has its trade policy and trade enforcement distributed among a number of agencies. So the U.S. Trade Representative actually negotiates the tariff. The International Trade Administration within the Department of Commerce investigates anti-dumping countervailing duties. The U.S. International Trade Commission actually maintains the tariff. CBP actually collects the tariffs and enforces the tariff itself, and various trade enforcement like intellectual property rights, also 337, patent and copyright, trademark. CBP was traditionally under Treasury until the Homeland Security Act was passed over 20 years ago. And then they split jurisdiction between Department of Treasury for Customs Revenue and then enforcement under the Homeland Security Act. But the Treasury Department, without telling anybody, transferred jurisdiction over tariffs to the Department of Homeland Security. So this is just our problem, but I want you to be aware of it. It seems like the president is working with his team in concert among all these agencies. Mike, I think, might get into IEPA a little bit, but that's what we call the latest type of duties that are going to be imposed under the President Trump. So there is a question about whether that's actually applicable and a basis of a statute that he can impose tariffs. So for the actual structure of the harmonized tariff schedule, many of you may be importing or exporting to the U.S. market already. And what's distinctive about the U.S., I think, is we go to the 10-digit level. Obviously, the harmonized tariff schedule is harmonized to the 6-digit level. So the first 4 digits are the headings. Then at the 6-digit level, it's the subheading. We go to 10 digits, and it's actually for statistical purposes. But what you need to know working with your U.S. importer is that it is considered legal and material if there's a mistake at the 10-digit level. So I've given you some examples of different products and their classification at the 10-digit level. The other thing that you should be aware of, at least in working with your U.S. importer, and this has come up fairly recently, particularly e-commerce a little bit, but also with original equipment manufacturers providing the harmonized tariff schedule number to the U.S. importer, which we think is a good thing because they are the party in the best position to know about that product. But U.S. Customs, we have a provision in our customs statute called transacting customs business. That means anything related to actually filing and submitting information to the government has to be done by a licensed customs broker. So U.S. Customs did come out with a ruling that said an original equipment manufacturer can furnish the tariff classification up to 6 digits, which is internationally harmonized. Anything beyond that is transacting customs business, which is exclusively the province of licensed customs brokers. Here is a list of the top 10 or items or commodities that are typically exported from Queensland specifically. It doesn't match up exactly with Australia as a whole, but obviously meat is a very large component. It outpaces everything else. And on the other side, I apologize, it might be a little small to see, but you know, as Lisa indicated, 96% of product coming out of Australia is going to be duty-free. However, starting April 2nd, we have the prospect of reciprocal tariffs. And what I wanted to show you here in this tariff page is to indicate that we will have to go through figuring out what is going to be added to that reciprocal tariff. So initially we thought, okay, so if the president overrides a free trade agreement, they would go back to the column 1 rate, the general rate, which I think in this case is 4% per kilogram, I think. But in looking at articles written by Europeans and others, there could be multiple rates that apply. So you'll have the duty rate that goes to General 1 from duty free, which is a special category of column 2. They're also going to take into account the Australia VAT or GST, plus any currency devaluation, plus any non-tariff barriers. So you could have 4 or 5 different components that are cumulative for that reciprocal tariff. Now, the good news is I think Australia is probably not high on the president's list of countries to rebalance trade for deficits and surplus. And so I think that means Mike might be next.
You need to unmute, Mike.
Yeah, I realized that. Sorry. I was just saying thank you to TIQ for inviting me to speak to the group today. I'm a customs lawyer, as was mentioned, so I am very much in the front line of all of these tariff wars. But I want to echo something that Scott said at the beginning of this presentation, which is, don't chase shadows. The reality is, bottom line, all this tariff gobbledygook that we're talking about today, for the most part, Australia is coming through unscathed. So whatever you've been doing, probably you'll be able to continue to do. The only caveat to that is, and of course this is probably why you're even attending this presentation, is the waters, so to speak, are moving very fast. Things are rapidly changing. Just the question ultimately will be for you in Queensland, do you escape all of this turmoil or not? My prediction, and it's not based on any insider information, is for the most part, I think you will. So that's the good news, which means you'll just want to stick with your Australia free trade, as was mentioned earlier. But let's go to the next slide, and let's get into kind of what's going on right now. One thing that's very clear, the post-World War II order of trade, whether you like it or not, I happen to be a fan and a child of that, but that's out the window here in America these days. That's basically gone. If that's not clear from tariffs and world events, I don't know if it'll ever be clearer. This presentation, at least my slides, in all candor, I worked on towards the end of last week, right? Today is, was it Tuesday morning? Since I put these together, at least my section of it, we have new tariffs announced today that are coming down the pike on countries that import Venezuelan oil. So China's a big one there, as are other countries, of course. The irony is that the U.S. is a large importer of Venezuelan oil, but that's another story. They're going to have additional 25% tariffs. So things are changing very rapidly. But again, from where you sit in Australia, I don't think much is going to change. The reciprocal tariffs are something I'll talk about in a little bit. That could be the wild card here, but as Marianne mentioned, so far Australia has mentioned to avoid the president's target. Let's say it that way. Mostly, I think because we don't run a large trade deficit. In fact, I think we run a surplus with Australia. So anyway, the one thing that should be interesting to many, whether again you agree or disagree, and by the way, not to talk politics, but you can definitely put me in the disagree column. As I said before, I'm a child of the post-World War II trade era, globalization. But where is this, where does the president get all this power to, put a tariff on every day? He seems to wake up and want to tariff something new and different. So where does he have this unfettered power? The reality is, in our government, the Congress has the power to lay tariffs. That's spelled out in our Constitution. But Congress has delegated a lot of tariff-making power to the president through different laws. Typically, those laws are based around allowing him to declare there's some national emergency or something for national security. So he's using that and saying, right or wrong, and again, arguments can be made both ways, that there is an emergency on this, a national security reason on that. But that's why you see the president announcing on his Truth Social platform, typically, which has no legal effect, by the way, but that's where he tends to post things before they hit the White House website, and then ultimately make their way into what we call our Federal Register, which is like our official gazette, which is what gives things legal effect. But he's getting all that power from Congress, basically. The other thing I would mention that's really important, and we'll see how this works with the reciprocal tariffs, is right now we have what I'll call regular tariffs. That was up on that page we saw a few minutes ago. I'll have it on another screen as well. But most of the tariffs, actually all the tariffs that have been announced so far, are add-ons. So things are kind of stacking one on top of the other. Again, if there's no extra tariff on an Australian product because you guys happen to skate, as we would say, or escape his wrath, then you'll just be dealing with the regular tariff and perhaps the Australia Free Trade Agreement that we have. That might help you eliminate that regular tariff that applies. But everything we were talking about today and all these tariffs you're hearing in the news are add-ons, typically in addition to. And the regular tariffs have not changed. We go to the next slide, please. Again, tariffs, you may have heard this in the news or seen Trump say this. It's his favorite word, the most beautiful word in the English language, according to him. And I think that's just because tariffs have a big impact. Again, like it or not, agree, disagree, whatever. The reality is, taxing, which is what a tariff is, a product, especially in the neighborhood of 25%, can have a big impact on business. So it gives him a lot of power that he can wield. In the case of China, they're already paying what Marianne referred to as, we call them IEPA, which is just the acronym for the law, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, that gave the president the power for national security reasons to put tariffs after the U.S. Trade Representative Office does a study. Anyway, punchline is on China today, their tariff rates are what you see on the screen. They're as high as 45%. And again, this is an add-on. So whatever the regular rate is, plus the 45%. Some Chinese industries also have what we call anti-dumping duties, which are yet additional. So the Chinese tariffs are getting to be rather draconian, to put it mildly. And again, China buys Venezuelan oil, so query whether the rates you have on the screen here are going to go up by another 25%. It's laughable, except it's actually, anyway. You probably heard in the news we taxed our neighbors with another 25% tariff for Mexico and Canada for being good neighbors. But the exemption we had is that goods that were entered with the free trade claim are exempt, meaning we have our own free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico. So if the good qualifies, just like you have, as was mentioned earlier, the Australia Free Trade Agreement, or the AUSFTA, I think was the acronym I learned today. We have that same exemption here. So query whether Australian origin goods would be exempt from any additional tariffs. Again, open question mark. And we also have tariffs on steel and aluminum, not just the steel and aluminum, but also downstream products, which we call derivative products. So the rates, as you see, you'll see a trend here. Everything tends to be 25. That seems to be the number he likes. We go to the next slide. Everything that you saw so far, though, this is what's in place now. Again, Australia, the only thing you might get caught up on, although for Queensland exporters, it's not a major area, would be aluminum and steel. As was mentioned earlier, most of your exports are meat, and meat does not have any extra tariffs, at least at this time. So there was this allusion to reciprocal tariffs, which I'm going to comment on in just one more minute. But we have other industry-specific tariffs that are coming down the road because Trump has ordered, or his administration has ordered investigations into the areas you see here: copper, lumber, auto, pharmaceutical, semiconductors, and I suspect that list will grow. And another big thing that's coming down the road here as we build the wall, the tariff wall around our country and decide to isolate ourselves from the rest of the world, is there's a study now to try to put a port fee or a tax on not just Chinese-owned ships, but on any shipping line that has Chinese ships in its shipping line, because the U.S. is trying to regrow its shipbuilding industry because we don't make ships really like we used to. So the theory would be if we put $1 million or $1.5 million or some high tax on every time that Chinese ship makes a port of call here in the U.S., that will somehow help our shipbuilding industry, or so the argument goes. That's not yet in effect, but that's another thing that's being studied and could have dramatic effect. And I would say for you, that one could potentially impact you only because it's gonna, to get your product from Australia to the USA, absent air freight, ocean shipping is the way to go. So to the extent that disrupts ocean shipping line and the shipping schedules, where those ships, if they have to pay $1 million every time they call in a port, the ships today might come to Seattle, then Portland, then Oakland or San Francisco, then Los Angeles, right? If they have to pay $1 million on every one of those, they might just ship just to Los Angeles, for example. So from the logistics point of view, that could have an impact on Queensland exports. But again, that's still a big question mark as to how all that's going to shake out. Next slide, please. So just this idea of reciprocal tariffs, the reality is nobody knows what Trump is going to do. I mean, we know he's going to do something, but the specifics of what it will look like remains to be seen. So, beef today, at least under the common HS code that I believe is used for most meat exports from Queensland, pays almost 4.5. It's 4.4 cents per kilo, that's the US rate. Australia, by the way, doesn't charge anything, as I see the tariff schedule in Australia, which is what you see on the right for the equivalent provision. It's free of duty. There is the 10% GST, but boats, I understand you guys have a boat industry as well in Queensland. The US rate for boats, I believe, is 5%. In Australia, it's 1.5%. So we actually charge more on boats than you do. The point is Trump going to go and have, in this tariff schedule you see on the left-hand side of the screen, is it going to go, one by one, line by line, to insert new kind of comparative tariffs for every one of the 170 countries in the world? I doubt it. The talk is he's going to have kind of buckets of categories and buckets of countries. So this won't be all at once on everything. It'll be some countries. As was mentioned before, both by me and other speakers, Australia is not likely to make that first cut of the list, or probably even the second or the third cut. Down the road, yeah, anything's possible. But in the immediate future, again, I want to emphasize, don't chase its shadows. You should be fine. Your exports should be relatively unaffected. And also, as much as I hate tariffs, because my job is to counsel companies on avoiding tariffs, legally, of course, and with every tariff, there's a winner and there's a loser. So this also could present opportunities. If you have competitors that are shipping products to the US from other jurisdictions and are now getting killed by these tariffs, it makes your product look a lot more attractive. So it could be an opportunity for you. Next slide. Again, we're expecting the announcement around April 2nd. That's not too far away. It's in a week, basically. And by the way, if you want to know, and I can't believe these words are coming out of my mouth, but if you want to know, you want to get the announcement, Truth Social, which query whether it's, Pravda, but that's where Trump posts a lot of stuff. You can find information there. So when the announcement comes out, I suspect it will be some, what do we call them, tweets? I hate calling them truths. Some post on Truth Social. You should check his page on that, and then as well as the White House website. We go to the next page. So again, the bottom line to me, and I want to wrap it up just to kind of keep the trains moving on time, as they say, we're still open for business despite the tariff wall that's being constructed, and we certainly are for Australian products. So I wouldn't panic. Yes, follow the news, but we're open for business. Should be kind of same old for you, luckily. One thing I would say to kind of highlight from the first speaker, with this Australia free trade, yes, we have free trade with you guys, but free trade, there's always two parts to it. And, nothing's ever free, as they say. But there's the substantive rule of origin, which for beef might be very easy, right? If the cow is in Australia and the meat you're shipping to USA came from that cow, it's not very complicated, right? But for making a boat, for example, there might be a content percentage. So you have to know what we call it the rule of origin is. That's one. And then two, even though there's not a formal documentation or like a certificate of origin that's needed, there's not. At the end of the day, the importer here may ask you for documentation to help them understand and be able to prove, especially if U.S. Customs is doing an audit or checking to make sure that the product is made in Australia. So just the last part here, and I'm going to, I think, wrap it up in the interest of time, but the slides, I believe, will be made available to you. But I'm trying to give you links in the next couple slides of where you can find more information aside from Truth Social. Like, what are the legal links? Where can I find, for example, if you're starting a business and you want to export something, how do you even know what the U.S. duty rate is? And it's basically from these websites here where you can download the rules of origin on this Australia free trade. Just one more slide, and then I'll stop. Actually, sorry, next slide. This is more about the Australian free trade example. Keep going. Yeah, so if you go to this website, this usitc.gov, you'll see on the right-hand side, it says trade and tariffs. Just the next slide, you would click on that, and then that'll open up what's kind of the equivalent in Australia. This is where you would find your tariff schedule. So that usitc.gov is where you find the US information. And if anybody has any questions or needs help, again, you have TIQ to help you. You can always feel free to fire off an email to me if you just need to know, like, where do I get the tariff on something? I'm happy to help. But those are kind of the basic websites, and there's a few more here to kind of unpack some of the tariff gobbledygook. But in the interest of time, let me end there, and maybe we turn it over to, is it time for Q&A, Scott?
Back to Marianne for the next section. Just before I do that, thank you, Michael. That was great. We're doing really well for time. So over to you, Marianne. And if anyone has any questions, please drop them in the Q&A. We'll come to that shortly. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to wrap up quickly to talk about the impact of the e-commerce market. And this has been roiling for a while over the last couple of years, and it's really coming to a head now with President Trump's second term. So who is affected? So sellers who offer products online, if you sell on social media sites, marketplaces who host sellers, company websites, so if you sell directly off your website, express air couriers and postal services. So this can be B2B, B2C, direct-to-consumer shipments where you don't have that normal importer of record, corporate importer of record, or an individual in the United States because it's being shipped directly from the factory to the consumer. So I think a lot of people are very concerned about continued access to the U.S. market. And what we have found is that e-sellers in the United States, they really don't know what they don't know. So they have outsourced the handling of the customs aspect of the shipment to their logistics provider or a fulfillment service. This quickly is just the executive orders regarding de minimis in case you need a legal citation. They have been put on hold because there are they're going to eliminate de minimis for China, Canada, and Mexico. China is the big problem. There are some estimates that 2/3 of the shipments, the low-value shipments that come in under $800 on simplified processes without an entry and duty-free, 2/3 of that is from China. So they really start trying to staunch that bleeding. And the reason Canada and Mexico was brought into it is because they're really looking at the fentanyl, which kills about 100,000 people a year. This is on hold because they need a process for customs and the postal service to work out collection of tariff with foreign postal services. In parallel track to the president's executive orders, in the waning days of the Biden administration, there are two proposed rules. One is about the entry of low-value goods, and the second one is about national security issues, and that's the additional duties Mike was talking about, Section 301, which are unfair trade practices, 201, anti-dumping countervailing duties, and then 232, which are national security, like aluminum or steel. These proposed rules are going in parallel to the president's actions. So there's a high likelihood that de minimis will go away. This is just a chart to show what the green state was in the past, where it was just coming in. You just had a manifest, 8 data elements, and it was just released off the manifest. Now we have an interim process, and then, of course, red in the future. They're really going to force people into either an informal entry environment and really reserve de minimis for really true gifts, bona fide gifts. But also maybe force people into a formal requirement, entry requirement. The big change here is they've come up with what they call an enhanced entry process, which will require, 10-digit harmonized tariff schedule number, the website of the link for the website where the product is offered. So it's an enhanced data set. And that may be onerous for a lot of e-sellers shipping to the US market. So this will result in higher prices. Again, going back to the tariff pages, this shows you a comparison of Canada, China, and Mexico. So it would inform Australia exporters by example, but this is what we had real numbers for. If you look at, let's say, the cost of a t-shirt, say is $5, and then you look at your preferential trade rate or your MFN rate in column 1. So China already has a high rate, 16.5%. Canada and Mexico duty-free under USMCA. But then you have to look at that second line of Chapter 99 that we use. That's the last chapter in the tariff. And we reserve that for those special additional tariffs of 301, 201, 232. So that already has, 7.5 for China. And then the new rates that we're talking about, I call them the executive order / IEPA. We already have 25% for Canada, Mexico, 20% for China. And here's where, so the duty is on an ad valorem basis. The cost for e-sellers is that you will have to pay merchandise processing fee, which is user fee that we support, our IT system and stuff. You'll have to pay for a licensed customs broker to file an entry. And so these really add the cost and almost double, what you could sell the t-shirt, or actually it magnifies it tremendously. The other thing I want to note, and I found this out the other day, I was unaware of it, goods subject to Chapter 99 duties are ineligible for informal entry above $250. So even though we have the $800 de minimis, and I know Australia has a fairly high de minimis for customs duty as well, if it is subject to a special duty rate, you're only going to go up to $250. So that applies right now for China. So that's a big issue. And the other thing that is going to be a cost also if you get into a formal entry requirement or above these rates is you may have to pay a surety bond. And that protects the government for the revenue of the duties in case the importer defaults or you default. So you're going to have to look at Incoterms. Most e-sellers or most foreign manufacturers, when they do direct consumer shipments, or the e-seller will do direct duty paid. So you have to look at your Incoterms again. Mike alluded to this a little bit. Country of origin is so critical. And one of the things that we're seeing in LinkedIn, Facebook, and other places is many people in the e-commerce space do not understand that the country of origin is where the product is made. So Mike alluded to, if the cow is in Australia, and you're chopping it up for pieces of meat, that's pretty clear cut. But as you get further in the tariff with manufactured goods, you'll really need to dissect where all the parts are from. We have a rule called substantial transformation. Also, in the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement, you look at your rules of origin that are applied to your product and use that. There is a de minimis provision. I don't want to confuse terms, but this de minimis provision doesn't have to do with duty-free entry. It just means that if you have a small amount of foreign product outside of Australia into the finished product, that's not going to destroy your rules of origin for purposes of duty-free entry into the United States. As I indicated, the de minimis shipments are exempt for now, but this is temporary because they're working out the mechanics. There is a high likelihood that de minimis for duty-free entry of goods under $800 or less will go away because the president's executive orders, the CBP proposed rules, and there are numerous bills introduced in Congress for the last 3 Congresses that haven't been coalesced, but I think the president's action and CBP actions will inspire courage within Congress that this is going to be a shift in policy, because Congress is the only one that can really change duty rates. The president has some power to elevate them for to address particular trade issues. But you're going to have to, it's going to require more money, more data, and more time to process. If you have a product that is regulated by another government agency, such as FDA, USDA, FCC, and others, you're going to have to produce more information to get this shipment processed. And you may be limited in what you can do and be forced to submit more information to get clearance. So I think that's it. And our contact information is up there, but you could also look at our YouTube channel. I've done a couple of videos talking about at least the state of play, but unfortunately it gets out of date very quickly.
Thanks, Marion, and thanks to all of our speakers for their presentations so far. Look, we do have about 10 minutes or so to try and cover off as many questions as we can. Anything we don't get to, we'll take those questions away and liaise with the speakers and get back to you. I will, each of the speakers, when we finish the session, I will ask you one final question, if you could just have a think about it. We've touched on a lot of the challenges. I think we've touched a little bit on some of the opportunities as well for Queensland. Right at the end, before we wrap up, I'll ask each of the speakers, I guess, to wrap up sort of your thoughts around where there might be pockets of opportunity for Queensland. But look, before we do that, let's go through some of the questions, noting some of them are quite specific. So, and again, noting some of the advice or I guess commentary will be general in nature, perhaps. Starting with the first question, we have a question from Liz. This might be one for you, Lisa, or possibly could be any of the 3 speakers actually, but Liz says, we have a fully digital product and service that we provide to US clients. Will we be charged a tariff if a tariff is imposed on Australian businesses, and how would this be collected?
I think that's a Marianne question.
Marianne.
Yeah, so it's a
apologies.
digital product, I mean, it's electronic transmission.
Yep.
Currently, under the World Trade Organization, there is a moratorium, I think since 1995 and 96, that there are no customs duties on electronic transmission. So digital products, and that gets renewed about every 2 years. The vote has gotten closer and closer, so we could see the end of that regime. But Lisa and I have been following the WTO agreement on e-commerce very closely. They came up with a text last year. The United States has not adopted it, so we don't know what the US is going to do. But for now, you should be fine.
Thanks, Marion. And on the topic of e-commerce, we do have another question in that space as well. Sophie says that she works for a fashion e-commerce business. I was told by our DHL rep that if the shipment is over $250 USD, SSN, I assume Social Security number, will need to be supplied by the customer for clearance purposes. Is this information correct?
I forgot to mention that. That's just come up the other day, and that's a big problem. So what they're probably looking for is a tax ID number. And if the customer is an individual, the only tax ID number we have is our Social Security number. And a lot of customers, US customers, are going to balk at that because it's such a sensitive piece of information. That's what they primarily use for identity theft. So that's going to be a huge problem.
And is there any ways to sort of try and navigate that, Marion, or is that something still kind of unfolding in terms of how that plays out?
Unless that person forms a limited liability company or some kind of company where they have a corporate tax ID that they don't mind sharing. But I went through this personally several years ago, and it's a huge problem. And I bet you we've heard of customers refusing shipments because they don't want to give out the Social Security number. And it's a hassle for people to get that tax ID number just for the purpose of ordering goods online.
Thank you. And thanks, Sophie, for the question. A couple of questions here on I guess, vaguely similar vein, possibly addressed to Marion or Michael. There's a question from Mike. We manufacture extruded aluminium poles here in Australia that are part of our completed solar lighting product, which falls under HS code 9405416000, which has been duty-free. Will the 25% aluminium tariff be applicable now, even though it is supplied as a complete product? It is an Australian-made product. It is Australian-made product. And then there is a similar question broadly in that same sort of topic from James. We manufacture medical stainless steel equipment. Will that be subject to the 25% tariff or fall under the FTA? So a couple of questions there around specific steel, aluminium type products and how they fall in.
Sure, I'll try to answer both of those, and with the typical lawyer disclaimer that none of this is legal advice. But so on the first one about the manufactured extruded aluminum products, assuming that's the right HS code, then the answer would be no, the aluminum tariffs do not apply to that product. So there's a list of products that are in the tariff schedule in what we call our Chapter 99. We also have them on our website, which is thetradelawfirm.com. You should be able to get them there. Worst case, just email me and I can send you the list of what is currently covered. But that HS code 940541 is not on the list. That said, the list of downstream aluminum products, which this would be a downstream aluminum product, except the HS code is not on the list, is going to be ever growing and changing. So you're fine today, 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now, who knows? But as of today, good news for you on that. I would add, had it been on the list, just to clarify, if you find that you have a product that is on the list, these tariffs are, as I said, they stack. So they're in addition to the regular tariff. And the free trade agreement will only get you out from the regular tariff duty rate. So had it been a made in Australia product, was built there, made there, qualified as Australian, it just means the importer in the US doesn't pay the regular tariff, but would still have to pay the aluminum tariff. But again, in this code, that HS code, you don't have to pay. Same thing for the medical stainless steel equipment. I don't know the HS code for that, but I'm assuming it could be 940320, which is metal furniture. If it's not 940320, then it's not covered by the steel tariffs. Same kind of exercise. You need to know the HS code and then compare it to the list. If it is 940320 covered, if it's not, probably not covered. So my only caveat there is just I would need to know the HS code for that to really answer it. But all the same things I said before about it could be Australian made, qualify under the rules of origin. That will not save you if you are on the list. It will not save you from the 25%.
Thanks, Michael. While we've got you, another question for you as well from Denny. For Michael, would the 25% tariff also apply for products exported to the US from maquiladoras, duty-free or tariff-free factories, generally in Latin America?
Sure. So yeah, the maquiladoras are a Mexican duty deferral type of structure that people use to bring materials into Mexico, make a product, and then ship it to the US typically. And it helps them defer the duties that would otherwise be paid in Mexico. So the 25% tariff that we have on goods coming, it's not really goods coming from Mexico, it's Mexican origin goods. That, let's say the default rule would be yes, that they do apply to goods coming from maquiladoras. The exception to the rule, though, is if the good is free trade eligible, meaning our USMCA, as we call our free trade agreement with Mexico and Canada, then right now, and at least until these reciprocal tariffs come down, they would be exempt from the 25% if the free trade claim is made at time of entry. So I guess in a high level way, I would say the short, simple answer without the gobbledygook would be if it's a free trade eligible product, it can probably avoid the 25%. If it's not a free trade eligible product, it would probably have to pay the 25%, even though it was made in the maquiladora.
Thanks, Michael. Look, a couple of follow-up questions, Marianne, for you. We'll cover those then, Lisa. We might come to you before wrapping up with a quick view of your, Queensland opportunities. Noting there are a few questions we may not get to. We will follow those up after. Marianne, question for you from Kelly, or a comment and then a question. We are an e-commerce brand who ship and clear via DHL. If we set up a 3PL, will that avoid the future de minimis issues and social security number issues?
Well, I think it depends on where logistically it happens. I suspect that what a lot of e-commerce companies are going to do is to actually set up a warehouse in the United States and ship product in bulk to the United States. So that's not going to avoid the duty, okay? The de minimis is pretty much over if you do the direct to consumer shipment. So it's all in how you do it. Now, one thing you could do is use a foreign trade zone, set up a foreign trade zone in the United States so that once you ship in bulk to the United States into a foreign trade zone, you'll at least defer the duty, meaning you don't have to pay it all at once for consumption. However, I need to caution you, setting up a foreign trade subzone is typically what you're going to do by an airport or an ocean port, is expensive, and it's another agency, the Foreign Trade Zone Board. It's about at least a year-long process, and it's not cheap. But at least, U.S. Customs, we now have parity for foreign trade zones in terms of de minimis, so you only have to pay your duty once that particular item is ordered and removed from the warehouse, so you're not paying it all at once. So what you're going to have to do is really map out your supply chain, literally of what happens where, to identify where the duty payment happens.
Thanks, Marion. And then final question for you before we come to you, Lisa, on E3 visas. Marion, could you please clarify the MPR fee on the e-commerce price breakdown?
Sure. The merchandise processing fee is a fee that is charged on all imports on an ad valorem basis. And it is to do a couple of things. One is to support our IT system called the Automated Commercial Environment. And there is a minimum fee that was on my slide. I think it's like $32, something like that. And there's a maximum of, I think, $634, Mike, something like that. So it's a minimum and maximum depending on the value of the product. So once you go into that informal entry process, as I talked about with enhanced entry for e-commerce shipments, then you're going to have to start paying that fee. And that's to support certain activities of U.S. Customs. So it's a user fee system.
Thanks, Marion. Look, Lisa, we'll come to you with a question. Are there any current or potential impacts on the E3 visa? I might also ask you for your concluding thoughts on whether, where you see there being pockets of opportunity in this sort of, new environment. And then Mike and Marion will come to you for your view on that as well. And then we'll wrap the session as we start to sort of run out of time. Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you. And I saw that someone had some comments about the E3 visas, which I anticipated because obviously there has been some recent announcements of changes to US immigration policy. At this stage, the E3 visa generally has bipartisan support in the US. However, there are talks from some lawmakers in the US of expanding E3 eligibility to other countries, which could actually reduce the exclusivity advantage that Australia currently has with the E3 visa. Something else to note is there is actually delays and consular backlog in terms of processing of E3 visas. So if you are looking to apply for an E3 visa, obviously you will need to take some of that consideration in. As well as there's potential talks at the moment of the E3 visa going to Irish nationals, which could again mean more competition for Australians to apply for the E3 visa. The other thing in the uncertainty, again, back to what we have all been talking about in terms of we just don't know what goes on. It's a day by day kind of, we're assessing things on a day by day basis. And I kind of like trying to measure everything that's going on. I kind of compare how quickly things change to the TikTok ban, because that's essentially how we as policy experts are monitoring the situation. So it's just a case of you just have to keep on top of it. And obviously the other issue in terms of the E3 visa, obviously we just don't know where that will go eventually in terms of trade discussions, negotiations, just after the April 2nd announcement. My only other advice around the E3 visa is to always check DFAT and their smart traveller advice, please, on that topic.
Thanks, Lisa. And then if I could just ask each of the speakers if you have any, I guess, final views on where you see potential opportunities for Queensland businesses may lie. We'll start with you, Lisa, and then we'll go to Michael and Marianne and then wrap the session.
I want to piggyback off a comment that Marianne made about supply chains and the importance of understanding your supply chain. We have seen a rapid shift even before the change of administration around supply chain diversification and resilience. So it's becoming more and more important that you understand what is going on in your supply chain and who your suppliers are. Traditionally, a lot of exporters will know their tier 1 to tier 3 suppliers and will have great understanding of that. What is now really important is that you do understand nearly everything that is going on in your supply chain. And that actually can be a competitive advantage in this scenario. The more you understand and know your supply chain, the more you can use it to take advantage of Australia's free trade agreement networks and take advantage of situations in the market over there. So it is an opportunity, but you do need to make sure you do understand what's going on in your supply chain and how to take competitive advantage of it with the opportunities that it does present.
Thank you, Lisa. Might head to you, Michael.
Sure, great, thanks. Yeah, just my closing remarks. I'll just repeat what I said earlier in terms of I think Australia is in a good position in these turbulent times with the tariffs. I think it will be business as usual. So again, don't panic, just look for the opportunities. And if anything, more than status quo, I think Australia will benefit. The more there are tariffs on your neighbors and other competitive other countries. Of course, Australia is not a low wage country, so jobs are not going to, or investment's not going to flock to Australia because of low wages. It'll go more for quality products, reliable supply chain. But as other countries are having more tariffs, of course, it's opportunity for Australia. So I think all in all, while all these tariffs are bad news for American importers, because they are the ones who pay the tariff, and maybe not good news for China, Vietnam, Mexico, Australia's in a good position, I think. So I want to end on an optimistic note for all of you, that I'm optimistic for your futures.
Thank you, Michael. And Marianne, over to you to have the final word.
Yeah, I would just say over the last several years, U.S. Customs has been more enforcement oriented, in part because of the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, obviously that deals with the Uyghurs in China. And so they are demanding more transparency into your supply chain, as Lisa indicated, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. I think the biggest cautionary tale for Australia is to the degree that you have Chinese parts or things that are in your supply chain. So, for example, there's a customs ruling from a couple of years ago for Volvo, right? I think China bought the brand of Volvo cars, which is sweet, right? But what they discovered is that all the sub-assemblies were from Chinese parts put together, then sent to Sweden, and then the fully assembled car was shipped from Sweden to the United States. Customs ruled it's a Chinese car because so much of the sub-assemblies were made in China. So you should be aware of that to a certain degree, but plan out your supply chain. I think in the end, we'll probably have a trading system of friends and foe, and I suspect that China, Australia is going to be in the friend category, particularly because we have a free trade agreement and there's not a huge trade imbalance from year to year. So I think you should be okay.
Thank you. And look, I just want to, oh, sorry, was someone about to add a comment there? No, my apologies. Look, thank you to all of our three speakers. It's a topic we could talk about for hours. I want to thank you again for sharing your expertise and your time this morning and your generosity in doing so. Look, each of our attendees, you will receive an email or an EDM after this outlining how TIQ, how you can get in touch with us to learn more. And you will also receive a link to the slides from today. So look, with that, we'll wrap it up. And thank you again to the North America team and all of our speakers this morning. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.